One of my favourite movies is Blues Brothers, and of course, during the home quarantine that I had to do in Canberra, I had the opportunity to look at it again. And one of the best scenes, I think, is when Carrie Fisher confronts Jake about not turning up for their wedding. Jake comes up with excuses. Honest, I ran out of gas. I had a flat tyre. I didn't have enough money for a cab fare. My tux didn't come back from the cleaners. An old friend came in from out of town. Someone stole my car. There was an earthquake, a terrible flood, locusts. It wasn't my fault, I swear to God. Remind you of anyone? Because it reminded me of the bloke who sits over there, the Prime Minister. It reminded me of him and his favourite phrases that he uses time and time again. It's not my job. It's not my fault. I don't hold a hose. It's not a race. The dog ate my colour-coded spreadsheet. There's never any leadership or any honesty from this Prime Minister. We've seen it from bushfires, through to Robodebt, through to the failure on vaccines and quarantine. This is a Prime Minister who won't take responsibility for his own words. A Prime Minister who is truth hesitant, this Prime Minister. He said we're at the front of the queue for vaccines. We know we've been running last in the developed world and not in the top 80 of countries. He said 4 million Australians would be vaccinated by March, and he missed that target by more than 3.5 million. He said that aged care workers and residents and people in disability care would be vaccinated by Easter. He didn't say which year, to be fair, but we know that as of today, if you look at aged care workers, people in disability care, less than half of that cohort have been vaccinated today. He said repeatedly, it's not a race. And when called to account for that, he had the hide to say that was about TGA approvals, even though the Therapeutic Goods Administration had already approved the only 2 vaccines that are available in Australia, AstraZeneca and Pfizer, some period before he repeatedly said that. This is a Prime Minister who never takes responsibility. He treats his own words like reptiles treat their young. He pushes them out into the world and then never has anything to do with them ever again. And if somehow he does run into them down the track, there isn't so much as a flicker of recognition. I don't know where that came from. We saw it again today, repeatedly. This is a Prime Minister who never leads. And the most important area has, of course, been in the failure on rolling out the vaccine and the ongoing failure on national quarantine. As we speak today, more than 18 months into this pandemic, there's not so much as a hole being dug on a new purpose-built quarantine centre anywhere in the country. Not one. And we know that hotel quarantine doesn't work. We know that hotels were built for tourists. And we know the absolute failure when it comes to vaccines. I spoke today in Parliament about my friend Khalil Ibrahim, whose parents died last week on Tuesday and then Friday, and who's buried both his mum and his dad, who were due to get their vaccines this week. Elderly Australians who weren't looked after by a government that was complacent and incompetent when it came to the rollout of the vaccine. But we see it in other areas as well. Today, we hear of a mass vaccination hub that's being established in Penrith. Good thing. But where's the one in Blacktown and Mount Druitt and those communities where the member for Greenway and the member for Chifley have been crying out for a mass vaccination hub? It appears political decisions even go down to that level. A government obsessed by colour-coded spreadsheets, a government for whom every action is about the politics. But it's not just when it comes to these issues, of course, as well, because there's much more. What we've had over the actions of the member for Dawson, Senator Canavan, the member for Hughes, is the government today, the Prime Minister said, oh, we voted for the motion. They did not say once the name George Christensen or member for Dawson. Not once. It was like Voldemort. You couldn't say his name. And the Deputy Prime Minister gave it up this morning when he said, we don't want to poke the bear when it comes to the member for Dawson. Just like the member for Dawson attending the rally in Mackay against lockdowns, against vaccinations, he said that was about freedom of speech. That's not leadership. That's not leadership. But we saw it as well, of course, earlier this year. The only world leader who failed to condemn the attack on the Capitol building. He said this, I think what's more important now is not for me to be providing lections to anybody. That's not my job. Every other leader around the world. We saw it with the response to questions about his friend, Brian Houston, being invited to the White House. He said that's just gossip, wouldn't answer the questions. We saw it with regard to the circumstances around Brittany Higgins. Here we have circumstances whereby the AFP has concluded its criminal investigation into the events just metres from the Prime Minister's office, and charges have been laid and that will undertake due process. The Gaetjens inquiry established by this Prime Minister about what his own office knew about these incidents, it has now been 5 months and 27 days, and we still have not had a response. But of course, with the March for Justice, we saw a Prime Minister who said protesters should be grateful that they weren't shot, like in other parts of the world. We see no accountability about sports riots, about pork and ride. We see no accountability or acknowledgement by this Prime Minister. In a fit of anger, he sacked Christine Holgate right here, but pretends that didn't happen. He pretends that he didn't say that electric vehicles would end the weekend, but we know that that occurred. But significantly as well, he said, I commend New South Wales for not having a lockdown. The consequences are half the country is in lockdown. Expecting him to take responsibility is like expecting a hologram to catch a ball. It's just not going to happen. There's a pattern of behaviour. When there's a problem, 1, deny its existence until it's a crisis. 2, when it does become a crisis, blame someone else. And 3, when all else fails, rewrite history and pretend you haven't said what is on the record. No shame, all smirk from this Prime Minister. No accountability. Even the National Cabinet, designed to hide information, has been ruled as not appropriate. We see the ongoing member for Bowman continuing to chair the committee that the Prime Minister said he'd be removed from, being replaced by a bloke in the fine tradition of the current member for Bowman as the LNP candidate rather than a woman. In bad times, leaders rise. This one has shrunk into nothingness. He's always there for the photo op, never there for the follow-up. We've been constructive. Our $300 incentive that we announced last week, what was his gut instinct? Not, oh, well, that's an idea, we'll consider it. Just no. Just rejecting it, even though Lieutenant General Fruin has said that it's a positive idea which should be considered as well as other measures. This Prime Minister is shameless, he's deceptive, and the more Australians look at him, the more they recognise that fact that this Prime Minister simply isn't up to the high office that he holds.
Order. Time is